A pre-tribulation rapture or enraptured by error. So today I'd like to take a look at the doctrine of the pre-trib rapture and see whether it in fact lines up with the scriptures. Interestingly to note in the Old Testament, when God's worldwide flood came upon the whole earth, so that was a pretty big tribulation period, and pretty much everybody died except for Noah and his family. Were they raptured out of it? No, they stayed on the earth, but God saved them through it on the ark. Likewise, when the plagues came upon Egypt, the Israelites weren't taken from the earth, but rather were saved through it. And so this would line up with the New Testament. We see Jesus in John 17, verse 15, praying that he said, I pray not that thou shouldest take them out of the world, but that thou shouldest keep them from evil. So explicitly, Jesus teaches for us not to be taken out of the world. Of course, we move down to Acts 1:11. Which says, Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye up gazing into heaven? This same Jesus which is taken up from you shall come in like manner as you've seen him go up into heaven. So notice it says he'll come again in like manner. It doesn't say he'll come again and again. Now some people look at John 14:3, where Jesus promises to come again to receive us to himself, and they look at that as a pre-trib rapture. So they teach that he's coming for us. He's going to meet us in the clouds. We're going to get raptured out. And then he'll return with us after 7 years. But again, my question is, why can't that happen at the same time? Why are those two concepts mutually exclusive? Why can't Jesus come back, we meet him as he's coming back, and then return to the earth? Why can't that be the same event unless you've already assumed or you're artificially making that sharp distinction as though they can't happen at the same time or be the same event? Let's move on and let's take a look at 1 Corinthians 15 and where it says, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. So this is where our transformation, this is where our resurrection happens. Is this this last trump, is this before the tribulation period? Well, no, because if you look at Revelation chapter 11, looking at verses 15 through 18, it talks about the seventh angel sounding. So now we're in Revelation 11, way after Revelation 3, where the pre-trib rapture folks say that the church has already gone and raptured. This is when the seventh angel sounded, the last trumpet, and then it says, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of his Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. So again, that whole idea of, well, we're raptured, the church isn't mentioned after Revelation 3. Well, that's an argument from silence, because the word saint clearly appears after Revelation 3. So what happens is pre-trib rapture folks say, well, those are the tribulation saints, not the church saints. But again, unless you have already adopted this dispensational framework, this invention where you make these sharp distinctions between church and tribulation saint, the Bible never uses the phrase tribulation saint, just says saints or believers. So again, that's something that you're already assuming to be true, but there's no evidence for it. And then just moving on, let's take a look about the verse where it says that God has not appointed us to wrath. So some people teach that this is saying that we're not appointed for the tribulation period. But does it say that? No, the verse says God has not appointed us to wrath. And what is the wrath of God? Of course, that is eternal punishment in the lake of fire. So it doesn't say that he's not appointed us to the tribulation period. Okay, and how do we know that? Well, look at the entire verse. It says, but to obtain salvation. What does it mean to obtain salvation? Well, salvation is everlasting, of course, and so everlasting inheritance in the kingdom of heaven. So that's the opposite of eternal punishment. Let's just compare Scripture with Scripture to see if that's valid. So let's look at chapter 5 of Romans. So Romans 5:9, it says, much more than being now justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. So clearly, the contrast is between salvation and the wrath of God in hell. Nobody thinks that Paul there was talking about the tribulation period. No, but salvation. Look in Matthew 13, and this one's very telling. This is the parable about the good seed, and then it talks about how the tares were growing up with the wheat. Now, look at verse 30 there. It says, let them both grow together until the harvest, and at the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, gather ye together first the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them. So notice here that both the believers and non-believers are growing together, but it's the tares, that is those who are not believers, that are gathered first to be burned. Well, that would pretty much refute the pre-trib rapture, which says no, believers are raptured first or gathered first, and then the tribulation happens. Let's move on to Matthew 24. And then this is talking about Christ's return. Let's look at verse 27. For as the lightning comes out of the east and shines even unto the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For where the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, then the sun will be darkened, and so forth. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. So clearly, here's Christ's return. That's pretty obvious. And now take a look at verse 31. It says, and he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So clearly, we have the Son of Man returning, and then there's the sound of the trumpet, and then the elect are gathered. And it's immediately after the tribulation. So I think the case is pretty clear. If you're a pastor that has taught this teaching, then I would ask you to reconsider what you're teaching. The Bible warns that there should not be many masters or teachers, for we will receive the stricter judgment. So God will hold you accountable for holding this view and teaching others. My greatest concern are those who have this view that when tribulation does happen, there's a lot of people that are going to get disillusioned. They're going to say, well, this is what my church taught. This is what my pastor taught me. This is what Christian radio and television and books said. How could they all be wrong? But again, we don't base our views on what the masses or the majority think, but what does the scripture explicitly teach? I, for one, used to hold this teaching, so I can sympathize with those who have bought into it, and I did for many years, but it wasn't until I looked into it for myself and studied the scripture that I was a good Berean that I realized, hey, this is error. The early church did not believe this teaching. It didn't arise until the 1800s. And so if you are a believer holding this, I pray that you would examine the scriptures, you take a look at those texts and meditate on them, and that you would believe that Christ will come only one more time, and that's the second coming, and that's when we'll actually get raptured or resurrected with him. And so may you be blessed in your studies, and I thank you for listening to this.